So I guess they're going through some crap. Okay, so we are on live right now on YouTube. So wave to the camera for 1 second, and I'm going to turn camera off and
Wellness on rhinoonair.com, WSPF-DB.com. And hello, everybody. So today I thought I'd cover a topic I don't think we've talked about on the show at all. And I don't think I've ever talked specifically about a syndrome, you could say, or a situation that is very common and is kind of a hidden danger to people. And it is hypertension, or generally known as high blood pressure. And again, I don't think we've ever done a show on that topic. So I want to go ahead and try and explore that a little bit. Now, a lot of people have this and don't know it. I discovered it on my own mother years ago when everybody else was unaware that she had an issue. I just happened to be kind of doing a general physical with her, just kind of a general kind of, how are you doing, you know, how are things going, how are you feeling, asking the questions I do just generally as an intake, but you know, this was with my mother, so it was just more casual. And because of some of her answers, I decided to go ahead and measure her blood pressure and her heart rate. And it turned out that when she went from sitting to standing, her blood pressure would shoot up. So when she was sitting, it would be fairly normal, but when she stood up, it was extremely high. I'm talking in the range of, it was over 170 over 90, something like that. It was well into the second phase of hypertension. And so as I say, a lot of people are unaware, and you may have some symptoms, you may have some signs that indicate there may be something going on, but they may not be prominent enough that you pick up on them or that you get checked out. So where does it come from is the next question, right? Where does hypertension come from? And there are a lot of possible causes. There are a lot of likely causes as well. But there are some habits and lifestyle situations that affect it. And so it's a good idea to kind of go over all of that and address some of the issues that are there that need to be addressed underneath, you know, underneath as underlying causes or underlying contributors to this situation. So, you know, because I do natural holistic medicine and I'm in a preventative focus, I tend to want to start with what should you do or not do to help this situation just from a basic level, help to either prevent or reduce blood pressure if you're hypertensive. Now, again, I'm talking hypertensive or high blood pressure, not low blood pressure, right? So if you have low blood pressure, that's a totally different situation and totally different ways of addressing it. And you have to be careful about things that actually reduce your blood pressure if you're running very low. Well, with high blood pressure, you want to reduce your blood pressure, generally, and you want to avoid things that tend to raise your blood pressure. So some of the things you may have heard about or be aware of are things like sodium, right? Foods like sodium. Sodium or salt can contribute to hypertension and high blood pressure because it draws fluids in your body. And so you tend to retain fluid when you're consuming too much salt. There has been some indication, there are some studies out there that show that sea salt may be better than, say, regular table salt. Regular table salt is refined chemical, basically. That tends to be more of an issue, according to these studies, than the sea salt. But I'm not saying you should go use sea salt. In fact, I'm not saying you should do anything, because this show is not about treating, preventing, curing. That's not what we're about on the show. Now, in my practice, that's a different story. If I'm seeing you as a patient, yes, I will give you guidelines as far as to what to do for yourself to help improve things. But on the air, we're not doing that.
Can I ask a question then? Just to backtrack just a little, because you started out with a very interesting topic to all of us, and we hear so much about blood pressure all the time. And I know this may sound, I hope it doesn't sound silly to you or to our listeners, but I would like if you could actually, what is blood pressure? Meaning, okay, so our blood flows, but how, and I see when they go on and they take your pulse. So what's the difference between pulse and blood pressure?
Right.
And then before, as we continue to move into what things affect our blood pressure?
Okay, sure. A little more clarification. So blood pressure really refers to the pressure that is on your heart at a given time, and the pressure in your vessels as well. So basically, there's systolic and there's diastolic. So systolic is when your heart is pumping. The pressure that is on your heart as a result of pumping action. The diastolic is when your heart is at rest or stops pumping. Basically it's not stopping, but it's pausing, right? It's the gap between pumps. That's your diastolic. Now, it's kind of an action-reaction situation as well, because the heart is pumping the blood because it is a closed system, your circulatory system. The pumping action is from the heart pumping the blood into blood vessels. And we're talking from the macro, veins and arteries down to micro, as in capillaries, right? And the smaller the vessel, the more the pressure, basically, because it's harder for the blood to get through a smaller region with the same amount of force on it. That's just a basic law of physics, pressure. So the blood pressure is a manifestation of heart pumping, but also the stiffness of your veins and arteries, the stiffness of your blood vessels. Mm-hmm. It also can relate to, or does relate to, the narrowness of your blood vessels. So this is an important, very important point. The narrowness of your blood vessels affects the blood pressure. So as I said, the heart is pumping at a certain level. It's pumping that blood out, certain volume of it. When you get down to the capillaries, down to the small microvessels, you're looking at more pressure because smaller volume or smaller, narrower pathways. So this is actually one of the ways that hypertension is created, or high blood pressure is created, is that through certain actions that your kidneys may be involved in terms of narrowing of blood vessels that then cause an increase in blood pressure because of the narrowing. So this is called vasoconstriction. Now, vasodilation is just the opposite. Vasodilation means opening of the blood vessels or widening of the pathway, right? Widening of, basically increasing the diameter, let's put it that way, of a blood vessel. So if you increase the diameter, you're opening up the blood vessel, you're dilating that blood vessel. If you are reducing the diameter, you're reducing the width of the blood vessel. Therefore, you are narrowing the blood vessel and the blood pressure will go up. So it's an action-reaction or equal and opposite forces kind of situation. You have the action of narrowing, increasing blood pressure, and the action of dilating, reducing blood pressure. So that's part of it. Now, another part is, say you have a certain volume of blood. Well, blood is a fluid. And blood, one of the main components of blood is plasma. And a large part of the plasma is water. So the more water you retain, the more fluid you retain, the larger volume of blood you retain, and therefore the higher your blood pressure goes, because you have a larger volume of blood that is in the same amount of space, therefore you have more pressure.
Wow, you have just, so when we're talking about blood pressure alone, you also then have to take in consideration your veins, and then you also mentioned your kidneys. Mm-hmm. So those three, I mean, I'm sure, I know that everything in the body works together, right, but there are some that affect, obviously there's a sequence of events that occurs, right, to create certain situations. So in this case, when we talk about blood pressure, it is the actual flow of the blood that goes through our heart. And then it can be affected by the valves itself of the veins. The veins. Going, and that is the channel for that blood to get through. And then you also mentioned the kidneys. And the kidneys are a filter, correct? The kidneys are filters, but they're filtering the blood. The blood goes through tubes or tubules and even microtubules within the kidneys. There are little regions within the kidneys called nephrons that are the filters inside the kidneys. And the blood flows through these little tubes or tubules in those nephrons. While it's being filtered, the narrowness of those tubules is controlled as well. And so there's the action of some enzymes in there that are going to affect the narrowness of those vessels within the kidneys. So, and that's how I know that, you know, you can determine if there's blood clots, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of other things that go with that. Or if the narrowing of your tubes that go, you know, your veins that go into your heart. But with all that being said, even, you know, before even going into each one of those separately, which you have been already giving us a really good explanation to help understand that process, what is considered a normal blood pressure? Because I have been to the emergency room And based on my weight or I've always been told that I always have had low blood pressure. So when I go into the hospital and it's above a certain amount, maybe for somebody else, they don't consider it high blood pressure, but based what I always see in my own body. And again, most of the times when you go to a hospital, an emergency room, this is being taken by a nurse or somebody that's assisting in the process. So it's really hard to me to understand then, and I have to completely rely on the person that's providing this information. And then half of the times they tell you, well, the doctor will talk to you about it, but you really don't get to talk to the doctor depending on the situation in the emergency room. It's very brief and they're in a hurry. So could you, I know I've gone a little lengthy on this, but it's the whole thought process and everything that's involved. You help us to also understand. So now I understand completely what my blood pressure, how that works, what's that process. How do I know, though, what is considered a normal blood pressure?
Well, there are standards that are studied, and basically the standard nowadays, and it's been changed over time. So that elevation of blood pressure, what's considered high blood pressure, has actually come down over time, and right now hypertension is defined. Basic fundamental hypertension is defined at 140/90. What's considered normal is around 120/80. And if you're getting way down there, you may be getting too low, below 100/60. So 90/60 is getting kind of low, and so on. So, but there's actually variations, even though that's the fundamental standard. There are some studies that are referring to basically stages of life relative to blood pressure as well, and that there are certain ranges that are considered fairly normal given a certain age and the state of an individual's health. So it's not just one specific number, kind of like you're alluding to. For you may run 100/70 or something, and then all of a sudden you're at 140/90. Well, that may be phase one for most people, but for you, or stage one, but for you, it may be even higher really relative to yourself. However, it's still considered just the beginning of hypertension at 140/90. So, you're right, that is kind of an individual thing, but there are specific numbers that we go by for the general population. A lot of things are done statistically, a lot of decisions are made as far as treatment and how to approach things based on statistics, based on the average person. And, there may be some flaws to that, but that's generally the guideline.
So before I interrupted you and asking these questions originally, you had started talking about, for example, sodium, how it affects.
Right.
And you also were mentioning about water, the plasma and the water in the blood.
Right.
So going back to that, so plasma is needed in the blood, but the plasma is also considered when you're checking blood pressure, or how does that work?
No.
Sorry.
No, I was just talking about fluid volume, and
Gotcha.
the fact that the amount of fluid that you retain affects your blood pressure. So fluid retention is increased by the drawing in of sodium. Okay. And one of the ways that the kidneys affect that, actually adrenals affect that, is by creating more aldosterone, which is a hormone that draws in sodium. They're kind of in an opposing fashion to a certain extent, but not as far as hypertension is concerned. We also have cortisol, which also can raise blood pressure, but it tends to be associated with the potassium level. So, and those two act as a pump across cell membranes, potassium and sodium. That's getting a little deep, but basically the retention of fluid adds to blood pressure. So the more fluid you're retaining, the more your blood pressure will increase, typically. And I've seen this clinically very directly. I had a gentleman in just the other day who we got kind of a high blood pressure on, and then he ran off to the bathroom. We came back, and I said, okay, let's do it again because I want to see before and after. So he came back in, sat down. His blood pressure had dropped about 20 some odd points systolic, and I think about 10 points diastolic. So fluid retention, just needing to urinate helps. You know, if you get that urine out of your body, that allows the rest of the fluid to be displaced and move down in to where it can be removed. So you're reducing blood pressure by keeping the fluid volume down. And this is one of the principles that's used in terms of treatment as well. Really a first go-to clinically for most situations with hypertension. The first go-to is a diuretic of some sort. Now, nowadays it's very common for physicians to use specific kinds of diuretics like thiazides, you know, so hydrochlorothiazide or HCTZ is a very common diuretic. There are various forms of diuretics, but I won't go into all that, loop diuretics, etc. But they are different in some ways. I think most physicians kind of think of them all as the same, but actually they are different a little bit, or they act differently. In the case of hydrochlorothiazide, there is a component that has benzene at its core that I kind of tend to shy away from anyway for other reasons. And there are some alternatives to that. And okay, I'm getting off track, but that's one of the first things you do is use a diuretic to drop the fluid volume and see if that brings the blood pressure down. So there's action you can take individually, like reducing your sodium in your diet. You can eat low sodium foods and help to keep that pressure down. Another thing that can be done is to exercise. And with regular exercise, that can be running, that can be walking. If you're very hypertensive, I do not recommend running by any means because you could increase your blood pressure to the point of having a stroke. So, but if you're just mildly hypertensive, then certainly a brisk walk can be potentially helpful in terms of getting that cardiovascular system moving. The movement of your cardiovascular system is an important aspect of keeping the blood pressure down, keeping that fluid going, okay? And it helps to draw off plaque in the vessels, which is a narrowing factor. This is associated with cholesterol. It's also associated with diet, including sugars in the diet, which is sort of an understanding that's been gradually improving. So there are many aspects to keeping yourself from getting too high in blood pressure. So one of the things that can affect you as well is stress. Stress is huge. Stress is major. And stress can catch you off guard as well. Like, for example, if somebody has a controlled blood pressure and gets into a very stressful condition or situation, their blood pressure may start to increase dramatically. And this is dangerous because it can lead to a stroke or a heart attack. And long term, this kind of situation leads to potentially to kidney damage as well. So you see that interrelation I've been talking about, the heart, the kidneys, you know, and because of the fluid aspect of it, the brain as well, you know, the blood flow. So you can have situations where you get an increasing or a dilation of blood vessels in the brain area, and then a sudden narrowing after that blood pressure drops, if it drops too quickly, can catch clots. So a clot could jam up your flow in your brain and cause a stroke or a CVA. Another possibility is the opposite. You could find that you may have an aneurysm, you may have some thinning of the membranes in your blood vessels in your brain that would lead to, or could lead to, a hemorrhagic stroke. So, or hemorrhaging in the brain. So these are variations on that theme. But all of them are important, obviously. So a heart attack, why? Because too much pressure on the heart. It now is testing the strength of the muscle. The heart is a muscle. So you may be pushing it too far, weakening the heart. And again, blood flow is an issue there too. So just like clots can happen in the brain, they can happen in the heart as well. So there's all these issues that come into play in relation to blood pressure. Let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll talk about more aspects after the break. You're listening to A Path to Wellness on rhinoonair.com, WSPF-DB.com. And A Path to Wellness is named after my practice, and you can tell it's holistic, so we'll talk more about that after. WSPF-DB.com in St. Petersburg. And we are talking about hypertension today. And we've been talking about some of the factors that influence hypertension, such as fluid volume, and that is directly affected by your sodium levels. So, too much salt can certainly affect that in your diet. There are a lot of potential causes or potential contributors to hypertension. And one of them kind of rubs me the wrong way because of something that I saw on television one time, and that is the use of caffeine. Why does it rub me the wrong way? Well, because there was this show where Dr. Oz was on, and he was, having a workup done on this fellow. He's a British fellow. I can't remember his name, but he had a show on CNN for a while. And he showed up as being hypertensive, and he asked Dr. Oz, is it okay if I have my coffee? And Oz is like, oh yeah, that's fine. Best sort of, it's the greatest source of antioxidants in the American diet. Great, have your caffeine. Wrong answer. Okay, caffeine specifically caffeine contributes to hypertension. So you want to cut back or cut down or cut off the use of caffeine if you are hypertensive. Anyway, pet peeve, what can I say? So the use of caffeine is definitely a potential problem when you are hypertensive or have high blood pressure. So sodium, caffeine. There are other things that can contribute, like recent studies in the last few years have been showing that vitamin D is important for blood pressure, and that actually that being low in vitamin D can be an indicator that you may have hypertension. I'm trying to say this correctly because it depends on how the research was done and specifics, about that. But basically, there's a correlation between low vitamin D and high blood pressure. Other correlations have been found as well, including with the thyroid. Thyroid function is related to vitamin D level, or I should correct that. Thyroid hormone usage in the body is related to the vitamin D level, because vitamin D is involved in the absorption of iodine into each of your cells. So if you're low in vitamin D, that can affect the absorption of iodine and affect the absorption, therefore, of thyroid hormone, which is largely composed of iodine, and therefore affect your metabolism. So one of the ways that we see hypertension a lot is in a syndrome called metabolic syndrome, right? Or we may see elevated cholesterol also, which can contribute to hypertension. We may see diabetes, and blood sugar variations can contribute to hypertension, and hypertension itself. So there's a lot of influences on hypertension or high blood pressure. And as I mentioned earlier, exercise is very important. Physical activity helps keep that blood flowing, keep clearing out the veins, keeping the levels of LDL cholesterol, or that low density lipoprotein cholesterol that's called the bad cholesterol, which is really a misnomer because there's no bad and no good. They have different functions, and actually, in a way, the function of LDL is a good function. So it depends how you look at it, but basically, elevated cholesterol can contribute to hypertension as well. Other things can be the weight itself. So, certainly activity can help with weight for probably the majority of us. But if our thyroids are low functioning, then we may not see a lot of improvement, no matter how much exercise we do, because we're not metabolizing correctly. So it's not a simple answer, you know. You have to look at all of these factors. Other factors potentially can be electrolyte imbalance, and as I mentioned earlier, stress is an important one as well. But electrolyte imbalance, well, what was I talking about earlier? I was talking about the balance of potassium and sodium, right? So sodium and potassium are both electrolytes, just like calcium and magnesium. Calcium and magnesium are important in all of this as well. In fact, one of the treatment approaches is using calcium channel blockers that affect the amount of calcium absorbed into the heart muscle and affect its pumping, also into the smooth muscles and into the vessels, the blood vessels, the walls of the blood vessels. One natural calcium channel blocker, something that some who are familiar with natural medicine or take natural supplements or something will be familiar with the calming effects of magnesium. Magnesium is a natural calcium channel blocker. So calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium. These are electrolytes. An electrolyte imbalance can lead to hypertension. Drugs such as birth control pills can lead to hypertension. They can also lead to strokes, blood clots, all of these kinds of things from birth control. Okay. There are options other than birth control pills. And I'm not talking about abortion. That is not a birth control method. But there are other approaches to avoiding getting pregnant other than birth control pills. So another factor that is important in terms of hypertension is alcohol use. If you use alcohol regularly, you may be more hypertensive. And certainly if you're already hypertensive and you start drinking a lot of alcohol, you will tend to contribute to that hypertension and possibly take it to the next level. So, as I mentioned earlier, there is this correlation also between kidney function and hypertension. And kidney function, one of the main ways we measure kidney function is called the glomerular filtration rate. Okay, the glomerula is basically an area that is part of the nephron that is involved in the control of blood flow and juxtapositional influence on the narrowing of the tubes inside your nephrons, which are the filters within the kidneys. So glomerular filtration rate has to do with the filtration rate of the kidneys, essentially. And if one has kidney disease, there can be a tendency toward hypertension due to that kidney disease. There may be a breakdown in the function of those filters. There may be, another possibility is a sensitivity to the action of the enzyme I mentioned earlier, which is actually an enzyme within the kidneys called angiotensin, or excuse me, the angiotensin converting enzyme, sorry, angiotensin converting enzyme. Taking that back a little bit, so there's a hormone called renin. Renin converts to angiotensin 1, and that's converted to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 converting enzymes, or ACE for short, are involved in the conversion of those forms. Well, what the action of angiotensin 2 is to narrow the blood vessels, to narrow those tubules inside the nephrons, inside the kidneys. So by narrowing those tubules, you're narrowing the area in which the blood has to flow, and therefore applying more pressure to the blood flow, and therefore applying more pressure in general. So you're increasing blood pressure. So this is kind of a catch-22 situation, because blood pressure, elevated blood pressure chronically tends to damage the kidneys. Then that damage can, in turn, raise the blood pressure. So it's a question of, chicken and egg, or which came first, right? So you may have some kidney issues that then lead to hypertension, or you may have some hypertension that leads to kidney issues that leads to hypertension. And then there are other factors involved in, related to the kidney, is the adrenals, which are these walnut-sized glands on top of the adrenals, or excuse me, on top of the kidneys, that secrete what are called catecholamines. These are hormone-like substances, or hormones that affect the blood pressure, that can affect the blood pressure, and they are stress response hormones. So cortisol, aldosterone, adrenaline, noradrenaline, these kinds of things are from the adrenals, and these are secreted in response to stressors. So this is one of the routes through which stress affects blood pressure. So those are a lot of the underlying factors involved in the creation of blood pressure issues. All right, so how do we address this? Well, I guess I should throw in on that topic, let me just mention Cushing's disease. Cushing's is basically an overproduction of cortisol that can occur, that can affect the blood pressure as well. So you're producing too much cortisol and it raises blood pressure. All right. So how do we approach this? Well, there's various ways. In conventional medicine, I've mentioned a few of these approaches. There are calcium channel blockers. There are ACE inhibitors, angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors. There are newer class called angiotensin receptor blockers, which have their own set of issues. There are what I started off with, which would be diuretics, right? That's usually the first way to start bringing down blood pressure, is use of diuretics, or just getting rid of fluid volume. There are beta blockers. And there are other variations on all of these themes, okay? You can have antagonists as well as blockers as well as inhibitors. There's all these kinds of combinations that we can use to basically interfere with the normal function of the body as a way of controlling blood pressure. And this is generally the conventional approach, is to try to control blood pressure by interfering with normal processes in the body. There are other approaches, though. Alternatively, in natural medicine, natural approaches can use substances that help by increasing the amount of space available to carry the blood, right? For example, vasodilation, I mentioned that concept, right? Dilation of the blood vessels, widening of the blood vessels. Widening of the blood vessels using herbal medicine can be accomplished to help to bring down blood pressure. And as I mentioned, the first approach typically would be diuretics. Well, there are diuretic herbs as well. There are many different types of diuretic herbs, many. So diuretics can be used, helping to, increase urination to keep the fluid volume down, but also vasodilation to open up the blood vessels and allow more room for that blood to flow, which reduces the pressure. Okay. Now, there are other ways as well, such as improving the blood flow. Just improving blood flow, just specifically that. There are herbs that target that specific function. How do they do that? Partially by thinning the blood. That's one of the ways that that's done. There are other things that can be done too, like reducing inflammation in the body. Why does that affect it? Well, inflamed tissues, one, tend to take up more space and bring up the blood pressure, basically. Okay. So there are a lot of these combinations that can be used. And in Chinese herbal medicine, there are specific formulas that are used that have combinations of these kinds of actions. For example, another one that I didn't mention is, for a lot of people, one of the causes of hypertension is stress, right? So stress can lead to increasing blood pressure. So one of the ways that this is aided or assisted is by bringing down the stress response. So calming down the production of cortisol, helping an individual relax, relaxing the nerves, the nervous system, calming the nerves. All of these can be done as part of an overall approach to help improve blood pressure. So calming herbs, relaxing herbs, anti-inflammatories such as fish oil. Fish oil also improves the blood flow and helps to reduce plaque formation, or helps to draw it off. And this is well shown in lots of studies, to the point that now conventional medicine actually includes fish oil as a prescription drug. But you can get fish oil off the shelf too. And there are some better than others. You want high content, high presence of EPA and DHA, and generally lots of omega-3 for that. EPA and DHA just mean eicosapentaenoic acid and docosahexaenoic acid, which are just forms of fatty acids. But they're specifically good oils that they're omega-3 oils that help bring down inflammation and help improve blood flow. And typically in the animal world, we find these in cold water fish, wild cold water fish, like salmon, pollock, haddock, cod, these kinds of things, tuna. All of them have the omegas in them. There are omega-3s in foods that are not animal, but there's also a lot of other oils in those foods. So the purest form comes from these sources that are just directly omega-3. Let's see. So I've gone around and around on this subject, but there's a lot of influences, a lot of ways of improving hypertension. And we can go kind of to the edge of that, looking at it from the point of view of mind, body, spirit, and get into the use of mindfulness as well to deal with stress, to help bring down blood pressure. So mindfulness, we can get into meditation, yoga, deep breathing exercises, into exercises that are very mild, such as Tai Chi, Qigong, and other forms of exercise that are relaxing, calming. Just going for a walk can help to bring your blood pressure down. Taking a warm shower might even help bring your blood pressure down. Things like this, just things that are very relaxing, centering, calming to help bring that blood pressure down. So the stress factor is an important one, extremely important one. And in some cases, stress kills, literally. Because, somebody who is hypertensive generally and gets under extreme stress can be brought from basic hypertension levels to extremely high levels and have a stroke or have a heart attack. So anyway, that's kind of a smidge on hypertension and different approaches, both natural and conventional approaches. Now, these can be blended together in an integrative fashion so that somebody can, say, be on hypertensive, antihypertensive drugs, but only to a certain extent, maybe keep them limited, and also be using herbal medicine to work with those to compensate at different times. One can also do some monitoring, check your blood pressure, several times a day and see if there's a pattern. Do you tend to have high blood pressure in the morning, maybe after sleeping? Maybe it is the fact that you've been lying there all night and your metabolism slows down quite a bit, and then that leads to elevating blood pressure. Or it could be that maybe you're not breathing very well at night. Maybe your breathing is not very good. That can raise your blood pressure as well. So if you're not breathing correctly while you're sleeping and you wake up with very high blood pressure, maybe you need to work on your sleep and your breathing. Or it could be that you tend to have higher blood pressure in the evening after a long day at work. Maybe you need to take a break during work. Maybe you need to go walk around the building or the block or something like that. Get yourself moving, get that blood flowing. So by looking at the times of day and correlating them to blood pressure levels, you may be able to help yourself simply by changing your lifestyle to compensate. But if your blood pressure is really extremely elevated, number one, get it down. Number one, like if it's somewhere in the 180 over, 100 level or above, you really need to get it down, because that is encroaching on stroke level. If you get above the 200, 110 range, 200 over 110, you're really getting close to stroke level. Your chances of a stroke are much higher. So if you're seeing numbers like that, you've got to get them down. You may need to go with the drug route to get them down quickly. And then start looking at, okay, once it's under some control, then be working on the natural approach. So, I help people in these ways. If they want to go integrative and just combine, and I help to improve upon what they're already seeing with conventional treatment. Or I may just strictly help them naturally, depending where they are in their range. There are different approaches, but there are also a lot of problems with the conventional medicines, and this is one of the reasons that a lot of people aren't compliant with conventional drugs, is because they have so many of these so-called side effects. They're not really side effects, they're effects of the drugs. And such as, I'll give you a whole list of them, like you could see more prevalence of cancers with calcium channel blockers, because it affects the calcium levels and depositing of calcium in various areas in the body. So you may see more tendency toward cancers. There can be kidney function issues with ACE inhibitors, angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors. A lot of antihypertensive drugs can lead to ED, erectile dysfunction. You may have headaches because of control problems with your blood pressure. There's so many things that can be a result of the use of these drugs. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be some of these kinds of issues with herbal medicine, but generally, herbal medicine is easier on the body, more natural, and doesn't cause all the side effects that these conventional drugs do. So, anyway, that's about it. I've really beat this one on the head. So let's just say that's it for today.
Now, can people send in some questions for you? Like as we continue to move forward with your shows, is there a way to interact, to ask questions? And the answer to that is yes.
There we go. I'm waiting for that.
And they can find you on Facebook. They can find the show through Rhino on Air on Facebook. They can find it through A Path to Wellness. We will also continue to post the phone number, because I think you mentioned that you're going to start at least the last 15 minutes of the show where we can open it up for phone calls and questions that people may have.
Right, so we can open up for phone calls into
Correct.
the show, yeah. And so the number is?
Oh, and we will post it. I have it written down right over there and I can't see it. I don't know it by heart, but we will start. Just wanted everybody to know that as we revamp, we're already in the end of September, almost October, going into the fourth quarter of the year. We're ramping up for 2017 is going to be the best year of all as far as sharing your news, your contribution of information that you provide for a healthier America.
There you go.
America.
America.
So you're listening, we've been listening to?
Yes, you've been listening to A Path to Wellness on rhinoonair.com, WSPF-DB.com.
And you are?
I'm Dr. Christopher Jackson, PhD, DOM, Florida, and I haven't mentioned that today, have I?
No.
But my practice is also called A Path to Wellness, and we are in Northeast St. Petersburg, Florida, and willing to see people from all over the place.
Absolutely.
So next time I am going to explore some topics revolving around healthcare and plans that are starting to be at least in the works to help people with natural medicine as pseudo insurance plans. That may be a great option for those of you who are really interested in getting coverage in a plan. And in some cases, that will be an ACA approved plan. So we're going to be looking at those.
There are
things.
those acronyms again.
Affordable Care Act, the Obama.
There we go.
So, but that allows coverage of natural medicine. So
See you the next week.
see you next week.